Welcome back, class. So we're picking up here at the road to independence after talking about all the different things that the British put on us as colonies that forced us to move towards independence. Now, this wasn't the first time that people had thought about independence in the colonies. It goes way back prior to 1776. The Massachusetts Bay Colony created the New England Confederation, so kind of an allegiance between the different New England colonies to protect themselves against potential threats from Native Americans or French. So that's an example that way before we even considered independence. In 1643, you had people discussing confederations like the Articles of Confederation. Ben Franklin in 1754 wrote the Albany Plan, which was a form of independence from British control, very similar to the Articles of Confederation. And probably most famously, Samuel Adams, after the French and Indian War, created what was known as the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty put on many protests against things like the Tea Act and the Stamp Act, most famously the Boston Tea Party. But these were really in response to the Boston Massacre and the Intolerable Acts. And you can see the image on there of the Boston Massacre, where several American colonists were shot and killed by British soldiers. So, in response to all of these grievances against the king, the First Continental Congress was called in 1774. Little arguments were made for independence at that time period. Most people thought that we needed to find a way to get representation into Parliament so then we could discuss with the Parliament and the king about how to implement fair taxes in the colonies. Most of the colonists consider themselves Englishmen, so they thought this was a very fair action to ask of the government to have membership in Parliament. So the First Continental Congress sent an olive branch, if you will, to the British government called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And they sent it to the king, and they said, these are our list of issues, and we would like them to be redressed. Things like, we would like our own legislatures. We would like to send members of the legislature across the ocean to Britain. The king laughed at this. Parliament laughed at this. They said, you are our colonies. You are not a part of the United Kingdom. You are colonized and ruled by us. Well, that didn't sit well with the American colonists. There are a lot of famous faces there, as well as I have in red there. Remember, if it's in red, that means it's not going to be in your test. But you have people like George Washington, Samuel Adams, John Adams, Roger Sherman, who brokers the Great Compromise at the Constitutional Convention, John Jay, our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Patrick Henry, Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, and James Wilson, who's a major architect of the Constitution, the Electoral College later on. So 2 years later, the Second Continental Congress is called after the shots are fired at Lexington and Concord. We're on our road to revolution. The Second Continental Congress is where you really start seeing some action happen. Our founders are meeting and debating, and it's lively. People are yelling, people are screaming, people are interrupting each other. It's disorderly, which leads to later on why we set up the Constitutional Convention the way that we do. But the Second Continental Congress, the major product that come out of it after these battles are fought, all 13 colonies agree to sign on to the Declaration of Independence, forming the United States of America. They also draft the Articles of Confederation at this Congress, and this Continental Congress essentially becomes our legislative body up until the time of the ratification of the Constitution. This is our first Congress. They're the ones running the United States of America. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Hancock were all at this Congress, but not at the first one. So Thomas Jefferson, of course, famously writes the Declaration of Independence, but we also need to make sure we give credit to those that helped him edit and write it. Ben Franklin and John Adams were also major players in that process as well. So we write the Declaration of Independence. What is the Declaration of Independence? It's this document that lists all the grievances we have with the king. It lists 27 problems we have with the king. It outlines what the purpose of the government should be. It outlines what natural rights we have as citizens in the United States. And we send it over to the king and we say, look, you're violating our freedoms and rights. Your government's not serving the purpose a government's supposed to make to protect the natural rights of men. And you need to get out. We're going to form our own government. USA, USA. So now the United States of America has been created. The Declaration of Independence is made public on the July 4th, 1776. So, of course, we We blow stuff up and eat hot dogs to celebrate our independence. So after the articles are written and the Declaration is made official, the 13 states are asked to write their own state constitutions. And they need to make constitutions that essentially are governing bodies over themselves because the national governments are very weak. This is one of the most inspirational periods in the world history of government and politics because you have 13 different states creating their own independent governments with separation of powers, checks and balances. How do we distribute power between the legislative and executive branch? How much power should the judiciary have? Should judicial review play a role with the judiciary or not? How many levels of your legislature do you have? Do you have an upper house and a lower house? Do you go unicameral or bicameral? Do you have a council in the executive or a single member executive? Should the executive have veto power or should the executive not have veto power? Should the executive have pardoning power or not? These are all questions that the states have to ask, and they all write different forms of government. So you have some, like John Adams writes the Massachusetts Constitution. You have James Madison play a role in the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the Virginia Constitution. So, I mean, you see all these variations of rights that are protected and the way to set up the different branches. And it's just all experimentation that eventually helps us write the Constitution because everybody gets ideas of what works and what doesn't work. So common features amongst these state constitutions: popular sovereignty, the right of the will of the people is preserved. Limited government, our government's limited and not absolute with power over us. Civil rights and civil liberties, there are some rights that are protected as citizens, and liberties, freedoms, freedom of speech, things like that. Separation of powers, making sure you have three branches with distinct powers, and checks and balances. You need to preserve it so that nobody has more power than another branch. So let's talk about our national government. The states make their own governments. What about our national government? The Articles of Confederation. You guys have studied this in history classes time and time again, so you're familiar that this is our first form of government in the United States, and our founders intentionally make it weak. Why make a central government weak with only a legislative branch and no executive and no judiciary? Why would we do something like that? It's not going to work. Well, would we just leave? You have to consider perspective from the time period. If we're leaving Great Britain, who has an overly powerful government, we don't want to stay with that overly powerful government. So therefore, we want to join in a government of a loose alliance of states that are agreeing to come together and fight the British and fight the war. They can make treaties. They can make money, but they can't stop states from making money, which leads to all sorts of issues between the states. But we operate under this government for a decade, and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And mainly it all comes down to one problem. They didn't have the power to tax. So let's talk about the positives and negatives of the Articles of Confederation. First of all, it helped organize us to win the revolution. That's obviously the biggest positive. The majority of citizens wanted a weak government. They didn't want a strong government because they saw what happens with a strong government with the British. Taxes, abuses of power, quartering of soldiers, things like that. It organized the Northwest Ordinance, the Northwest Territory, basically north and west of the Ohio River, because historians are good at naming things. So the Northwest Ordinance eventually becomes 5 states, and it helps organize a little bit of Minnesota as well. And basically it plots the land. It helps us know if you buy territory, if you buy land in Indiana, it helps recognize that. It bans slavery in that territory. It also recognizes that the Indians have claims to the land that need to be respected, ironically. The negatives far outweigh the positives, though, in the Articles of Confederation. First and foremost, no ability to tax. They can only request funds from the states, which means the government is dead broke. Okay? No ability to regulate trade between the states. No regulation of interstate trade. Means that states can ban products from being sent from other states. It leads to trade wars between states and friction between the states. In order to get anything done, 9 of the 13 states had to agree to it. Supermajorities are very ineffective normally. And in order to amend it, you had to have all 13 states agree. There are 0 amendments passed. And lastly, there's no executive and no judiciary branch, only a legislature. So they can't enforce their laws and they can't interpret their laws. They can only make them, making it worthless. Thank you.